Smith. Maybe a couple of seconds and I will.
Debate is an important element of progress. Hello and welcome to A View from Afar. This week I'm joined by political scientist Paul Buchanan to discuss the shifting political alliances in the Middle East region, Belarus, a generational clash between the old guard and the new democratic wave, and the latest in the race toward the US presidential elections. But first, a message for those who are joining us live. If you are joining us via the social media platforms Facebook, Twitter or YouTube, feel free to make comments and share your views, as we'll be able to see them and also include you in our live program. Okay, so let's check out what our debating points are for the show today. A view from afar. What's behind the United Arab Emirates Israel deal? Lukashenko. He's lost respect of the Belarusian people, but will he lose power in the Eastern European state? And Trumpianism. Is it even a word? Is it for export? And how is the Democratic National Convention shaping up in the United States? So across to Paul Buchanan. Good afternoon, Paul.
Hi, Selwyn. Nice to be with you again.
What do you make of this United Arab Emirates Israel deal, Paul?
Well, it's interesting on many levels. I'd say that in a weird way, it's been facilitated by the fact that the U.S. has withdrawn as a strategic actor from the region. It doesn't have the influence that it used to have, even though it supposedly helped broker this deal. But there's a much larger geopolitical play here. I mean, let's go through the easy points and then talk about the thornier issues. The easy point is this. Many hardline Israelis, as well as people in the pro-Israel lobbies in the States, have long argued that a more comprehensive Middle East peace settlement between Israel and its Arab neighbors was not dependent upon first settling the issue of Palestine. And that's been rejected for the years by the Arabs themselves, who have said, no, you need to find some solution, two-state solution, one-state solution that gives the Palestinians the autonomy that they deserve. And that's been rejected by Israel over the years. Well, as it turns out, Benjamin Netanyahu, who has been one of the most vocal people saying that we can cut a deal without the Palestinians being involved, has been proven correct at a very fortuitous time in his political career. You know, he's been reelected in a coalition arrangement, but he's also facing trial for corruption. Yeah. So this was a big win for him, and everybody's pointing to that.
But isn't this was designed by Trump, surely, and his son-in-law, isn't it?
They're going to take the credit. They don't have the wherewithal to design a deal like this. They prodded the Emiratis to be the first to sign on. You see, part of the bigger play is that this is the lead, the thin edge of the wedge into the Gulf Cooperation Council. So the Qataris, the Saudis may eventually buy onto this deal, assuming that it holds. But let me just say something about the deal itself. True, it has now been proven that the Arabs, the Arab oligarchies, are much less interested in the fate of Palestine, if they ever were.
Yeah, if they ever were.
I mean, I hate to say it, but the Palestinians are the Kurds of the Arab world.
You know, this is one of the areas where I have great unease about observing this type of deal. On one hand, the Palestinian identity, their right to actually live in their own country, seems to have been forgotten in this whole deal. So really, when it comes down to it, how can a deal actually sustain itself long term, considering that? And the other thing is the Gulf states. it sounds and seems to me that they've got their eye on some sort of supremacy relationship here, so that they actually, the Sunni side, the Gulf states, can look across at the Shia over in Iran and think, well, we've got the upper hand now, you better play the game.
Yeah, and that's a very good point, and to where I was heading in terms of the bigger play. But yeah, absolutely. Two things on that of that coin. The Palestinians are going to have to reflect on this and to decide whether or not they want to continue to negotiate for a two-state solution with the Israelis. The Israelis have to adhere to their side of the bargain. It remains unclear that they will not continue to annex territory in the West Bank. They say they won't, but promises have been broken on both sides in the past. So
And it seems, sorry, Paul, it seems, considering the alignment here, that the Israelis under Netanyahu have got the opportunity to actually, let's say it, steal more land.
And they could well do that. The thing is, they've got to balance continuing to push the quote-unquote reclamation of land in the West Bank in particular, with whatever strategic benefits they will accrue for getting the deal not only with the Emirates, but with the GCC as a whole. But therein lies the rub. All of this is set against the background of Iran's emergence as a regional power, in part because of its strengthening alliance with the People's Republic of China.
Yeah.
A number of bilateral agreements have been signed between China and the Iranian Republic.
This is like a shield in some ways, isn't it?
It is, and remember that the Iranians have good security ties to the Russians as well. But the Chinese are in Iran now as full partners. We know, for example, that the Chinese also have a military base in Djibouti.
Yep.
So that's their expeditionary force. They got about 6,000 troops there. Now they have these ties with the Iranians to include building electrical plants. There's some rumors that there may be some nuclear cooperation. There is defense cooperation. Well, with the Chinese backing the Iranians, as you just said, the Sunni side of the Arab world feels more threatened than ever, as does Israel.
So which is the cause effect here? We look at that. Are the Gulf states, are they positioning to get ahead where they feel that they've been lagging, or are they getting ahead and then you've got Iran and China actually responding to that?
Well, I think what happened was they don't feel abandoned by the United States, but it's like, their trapdoor overalls, fell open,
Yeah.
and they feel a little exposed.
Yeah.
Because, the Chinese do give them a lot of cover. I mean, you can't preemptively attack Iran if there are Chinese nationals in and around the power grid and that sort of thing. And again, there's economic ties. The Chinese economic ties violate the U.S.-imposed sanction regime. And we have to remember that the U.S.-imposed sanction regime on Iran has no basis in international law. It's a unilateral action on the part of the states. But the states has the ability to impose third-party sanctions. So, for example, if New Zealand trades in strategic materials with Iran, the United States can sanction us, can cut us off from money flows, freeze banking accounts, that sort of thing. Now, we don't trade in strategic materials with the Iranians. We trade in foodstuffs and that sort of thing, which are not liable for sanction. Well, the Chinese have come in. They're buying Iranian oil. In fact, they're investing in Iranian oil infrastructure because no one else can. They have deal for airplane parts. And so they're an immovable object. I mean, the United States may think to add China to the sanctions regime and add more trade sanctions, but quite right now, that's not working out too well for the United States.
No, it's not. And China's economy, it's proving to be very robust. Obviously, there was an underestimation relating to its ability and its manufacturing core to actually respond to US trade sanctions. We get back to here, the Al Jazeera clip is just been underscoring the Netanyahu-Trump relationship. So when we're looking at solutions to all the potential problems here, And I take it from what you were saying that the Chinese element is really a sense of Iran's own defense shield. But let's have a look at some of these issues here with the superpower and Israel talking about this issue.
The United States by Israel and by the UAE amounts to a full normalization and a development of full ties between the two countries. The statement says that that delegations from both countries will meet in the coming weeks to sign these agreements, that there will be normalization of diplomatic ties, of economic, medical, technological, telecommunications cooperation, direct flights between Israel and the UAE, tourist flights as well as business flights.
So on that, Paul, what I've been picking up this morning New Zealand time or the evening US time is that Trump did a stand-up with media about an hour ago where he was underscoring the fact that he believed Iran was in a very weak point now, considering this particular new arrangement, this new deal that's gone through. And he is subjectifying the fact from his point of view that there's opportunity for all of the Gulf states, Israel, and to a degree Iran, if it takes a back seat to this, to actually advance some sort of deals on all the technologies, the commodities, the manufacturing areas. Look, I know in my paraphrasing it sounds like it's all over the place, and that's how it came across. So can you make sense of what exactly the Trump administration's gain, or what it believes it's as gain out of all of this?
Well, let's do it this way. Let's put ourselves in the Iranian shoes. There's not much they can do about this whatsoever, but they do have these big partners in China and Russia. And remember that the abandoned nuclear deal was only abandoned by the United States. I mean, there's ongoing discussions with the European partners, the Russians and China, about the nuclear deal. Now, from the Iranian standpoint, if you look over there, you've got two leaders, Netanyahu and Trump, with serious credibility problems, and both of them may not be around in 6 months. If Trump wins in November, his election is going to be tainted one way or another, so it'll be delegitimated. And Netanyahu has serious legitimacy problems right now. Massive demonstrations against his corruption. The coalition deal that was struck in Israel to keep him in power was very dodgy, to say the least. And so the Iranians can wait these guys out. Plus, think about it in terms of the Emiratis themselves. By fully opening and being the first to opening with Israel, they open a can of worms with their fundamentalist base. I mean, this is a step too far for not just jihadists, but conservative Sunni leaders, Wahhabists, Salafists, and the like. And I got a feeling that they've opened themselves up, if not to violent attacks at home, to violent criticism that could undermine their domestic stability. So right now, the best play for the Iranians is wait and see.
Right.
Don't do anything provocative, but just wait and see.
And gather your big mates on the block, basically, or invite them into the block, like the China situation you've underscored. And where is Russia in all this, Paul?
Well, Russia's, it's playing a quiet hand in a pro-Iranian way. Remember that Russia has a strategic rivalry with the Middle Eastern oil producers. I mean, again, it's a fossil fuel competition, if you like, and they're not the dominant player in that competition. So they're going very quiet. What they say in Italian, sotto voce, very quietly. Well, but they're working. They're talking to the Chinese. The Russians are not doing this in a vacuum.
Yeah, exactly, and nor is the Chinese. Yeah, so there's a block in play. So let's talk at the softly, the quietly kind of approach that Russia is playing here, and see what kind of a quiet approach it's actually taking to Belarus. We'll just show this very nice transition. We'll come back on that point. Yeah, so what we spoke last week in our program, A View from Afar, significantly about what was happening in Belarus. As things have shapened up over the week, some of your instincts are proving correct, Paul, that It wouldn't be years before the democracy movement started to actually get more gains and some attention. It seems that during the week, the aspirations of the democratic movement in Belarus have been lifted. Mass protests, mass outturns of people, not just the young, but of all parts of society, of all ages, all genders. We also, while the leader of the Democratic Party over there, or what is believed to be potentially the winning party in Belarus, put more likely, is still seeking refuge in neighbouring states, we have a kind of a shape of a potential government in waiting. Let's just have a look at this clip here from the BBC.
That council. It says its goal is to organise the transfer of power using lawful means. It was set up by the main opposition candidate in the election, Svetlana Tikhanovskaya. She's had to flee the country. We'll hear a bit more from her later. This is what Mr. Lukashenko told the state-owned news agency in response. He says, we see it unequivocally. It is an attempt to seize power, and we have enough of these measures to cool down some hot heads. The council has denied it's attempting to seize power. Meanwhile...
So, Paul, what do you make of this whole thing? Where is Russia in this? Earlier in the week, it looked like Russia was actually being pulled into this crisis inside Belarus. And where is democracy amongst all this juxtapositioning?
Well, democracy is still far, far away. The Russians have put the brakes on any overt show of support for Lukashenko, and they're certainly not going to intervene militarily, particularly when they're preoccupied with events in the Ukraine, in Libya. Remember, the Russians are now in Libya, as well as Syria. So they're there, but they're putting distance on Lukashenko, in contrast to the apparent rapprochement last week. Now, let's be very clear. The Achilles heel of authoritarian regimes like this, personalist authoritarian regimes, is the question of succession. See, most modern authoritarian regimes, be they military, bureaucratic, or one-party authoritarian, have a succession mechanism. So the old leader is replaced by the new leader in an orderly fashion. It's what makes, for example, the actions of Jinping Xi in China so difficult to understand, because he's disrupted that orderly succession. Now it's all about him.
And we've seen Putin take, maybe the end game is similar, but different means of being able to do the same thing, in the Russian Federation.
I'll tell you what, for the authoritarians, it's a very bad long-term move. Lukashenko has always been the power. He has not delegated. He has not broadened, if you will, his regime outside his personal entourage. And so because he has not solved the succession question, he's got to go. Okay, he is the focal point. He can bark all he wants, but he's finished.
And you think that's where Putin and the Russians are sitting on this particular type of thing? I mean, just look at the image there that we've got on screen, where we just accidentally freeze-framed on that BBC report there. You've got, this is no cabinet round table. This is Lukashenko right at the front. Lukashenko, he's dominating. Everybody else down each side sitting there nodding as he speaks.
Yeah, this is quite... Look, he has no legitimate feedback loops around that table. But more importantly, it's very clear that the Russians have given a tacit nod to moderate elements of his regime, as well as the opposition, that they can proceed with their negotiations. The clip that showed that group of people, that is the coordinating committee of the opposition, minus its exiled leader, who's going to remain in Lithuania until it's safe for her to come home. Now, the important thing is this. When you study authoritarianism, once you've seen whether or not they have solved the problem of succession, if they have not, then you look at what are known as hardliners and softliners within the regime, as well as the opposition. And it becomes a strategic game. In order for a orderly, peaceful transition to occur from the old dictator to whatever new is going to happen, the moderates on both sides have to win
Right.
in their respective,
So-
coalition.
So that's exactly what you're waiting to see here. Are you waiting to see an arm come across from the authoritarians with a more palatable face, and those of the opposition movement, they pick out a person that they think they can negotiate with, and you look like you're establishing some sort of rapprochement between the two? Is that what you're waiting for?
Yeah, it's a two-step game, okay? And what it basically means is the moderates in the opposition have to win and become the dominant faction, and the moderates in the regime have to win. The hardliners have to be excluded, and then you make a compromise between the two sides that is some sort of power-sharing arrangement. Right. Think of it this way. They're on the hardliners in the regime are saying, squish them all.
Yeah.
Destroy them. Kill them off.
Yeah, and that's what they were doing until the mass rally started in the last few days.
They had the upper hand.
Yeah.
And it didn't seem to work. Now, the hardliners in the opposition are like, let's string Lukashenko up on a pole and kill his family too.
And you look, when he spoke, for example, to all those workers in industry, state-owned industry earlier this week, and they basically started chanting, leave, get out, leave, leave. And he packed up his kit and off he went. I thought that was like a Timisoara moment, Romania, when you had Ceausescu standing there before the hordes, and then there was unrest starting and the noise started, and you can see confusion on his mind. This guy, he bailed from the podium.
He did, but he's come back with a more hard line. And that suggests to me that he feels confident that his repressive apparatus, in spite of some defections, remains largely united behind him. Because they're a part of his regime. They've benefited. His military command, his secret police, all those people have a lot to lose if Lukashenko goes. So the compromise deal, very similar to what happened when Pinochet was eventually outed from office in Chile in 1980, is for members of his regime who have moderate views and want to survive to play again down the road, cut some sort of deal with the moderates in the opposition, and the deal will inevitably be this. Lukashenko goes, and he can go peacefully. He can go into exile in Russia and take his billions with him. Some other nasty people in his regime, they can go. Unfortunately, it's a very adult business. Sometimes you can't get justice all the time in the interest of something much bigger. But the point is, he's done because he is the focal point. And the question is, who's going to succeed him? Now, Belarus has no history of democracy ever. So the idea that this grassroots movement from the streets fully comprehends the back and forth that a democracy entails, the give and take, the need to compromise, the mutual second best, that's a pipe dream. What we need is an incremental, step-by-step move to a more open regime. And then perhaps, democracy down the road. The first step in that is a reholding of elections that allow for full participation of opposition parties, and then some power-sharing arrangement.
So that's the solution.
The outcome.
That's the solution.
That's the solution. Over the short term. I mean, Lukashenko has to go as part of that. But I'd say, again, let's take a 6-month time frame, because this is going to come to a head within 6 months, if not sooner. Some deal has to be cut so that whatever legacy of the regime that is good is allowed to remain in place. Yeah. And the more personalist attributes, that's all stripped out of it, and the opposition gets a bigger and bigger voice in the running of the country. If they do that, again, it's 2 steps forwards, 1 step back type of move. If they do that, we could actually have the prospects for a peaceful transition. Even if it's not fully democratic, will be not as autocratic as the current personalist regime that they're rebelling against. And again, a rebellion is not a revolution. Yeah. It's an expression of anger, but it's not a full revolution. Revolutions are violent, And at this point, violence would favor the repressive apparatus,
of course,
not the grassroots movement.
And there are other types of revolutions, obviously, as well. The Orange Revolution, the Velvet Revolution, etc., etc. But take your point there. So, talking about deals, let's just take a quick transition break, and then we'll talk about Trumpianism. Is it even a word? Is it up for export? And how is the Democratic National Convention shaping up in this presidential race? Yeah, so Paul, talking about Trumpianism, is that a word? Can we define his type of politics, and is it up for export?
Well, it has now become a word in the vernacular of modern day politics, and it can be interpreted many ways. But I'll offer you just one. Again, we could go many directions with this. Trumpianism is a type of political behavior where a leader engages in the politics of rumor, innuendo, and conspiracy. And what I mean by that is that a leader will come out and hint at or claim completely unsubstantiated things, many of them born of social media, many of them born of deliberate disinformation, in a pursuit of some political gain. And so if you insinuate that your opponent is a dog beater, then, it's one of those situations where the opponent has to come out and say, I never beat my dog. You're off now talking about tangents that have nothing to do with the relative merits of any policy position. Well, Trump is the master at that. Absolutely genius in what I consider to be a very evil way. And what is very clear is that strategy of rumor mongering, conspiracy, echoing, is now gone around the world to include here in New Zealand. And it's mostly the province of right-wingers and right-wing parties. But let me just say, it works.
To a degree.
It absolutely works.
Unless you get caught out. So,
but see, his strategy is when caught out, double down.
Right.
And the issue is this. It's genius as a short-term political strategy. You have your opponents constantly scrambling to address unfounded rumors and innuendo. However,
it's that thing about you explain, you lose.
Exactly. That's a very good point. Now, the short-term benefits, they're clear. You have to be unethical in order to do that. You can't be an ethical politician and engage in Trumpianism. The trouble for us living in these liberal democracies is that over the long term, the repeated use of Trumpian methodology, going back to that well time and time again, undermines public faith in democratic institutions and governance. And so it's more than your opponents. Sure, you can hurt them in the short term, particularly for electoral gain, and both New Zealand and the United States have elections this year. But then what? After that, they can do it to you. I'm not so sure that the New Zealand Labour Party, which is in government here now, would resort to the sort of tactics now associated with Trump. But on the other hand, there may be unscrupulous politicians on the left who say, look, what's good for the goose is good for the gander. And we're going to do the same. And it is, in fact, now entered into mainstream political narratives.
Yep.
These conspiracies are picked up by the mainstream corporate media. And so it's here to stay. The question is, how do we deal with it if we want to stay ethical and principled and support a democracy?
Well, then I was just going to take it back, in the New Zealand context. There's clearly a situation where the National Party's scrambling around for every percentage point in the polls it can kind of get. It looks to the fringe. It can see conspiracy theories are being soaked up and presented by particular fringe parties. And it's probably thinking to itself, well, there's a few points in this. So then you get its deputy leader, Jerry Brownlee, trotting out all of these questions, doing a bit of a furrowed brow and saying, well, I'm not saying there's a conspiracy here, but it's interesting points, isn't it? So it's that kind of thing, for our audience overseas of what you were kind of doing a comparison. It's a more softly softly approach that in New Zealand the National Party is taking, but it's still, I can see the merits in what you were saying. It's bedded into that Trumpianism style or way of politics, isn't it?
It is, and I look at for the 20 some odd years that I've lived in New Zealand, I have said to my political friends that the one thing we must resist is the Americanization of our politics. Our politics used to be about policy and principle. Increasingly, they're about personality and scandal. I've said the same thing to Latin American friends, especially those with presidential systems, let's say like Argentina, and said, look, we don't want to go down this path. For many reasons. I mean, there's lobbying, there's attack ads, that whole shebang. This is a clear instance where we don't want to Americanize New Zealand politics because it's pernicious. And again, it's not about the parties doing it or who wins in the next electoral cycle. It's about the long-term undermining of faith in democratic governments and institutions. And let's be very clear, all of this is happening at the same time that there are deliberate attempts to interfere with the New Zealand electoral and political systems by foreign actors, the Chinese and the Russians in particular.
We can see evidence of that in the Facebook feeds. It's not just the Americans, not just the United States citizens that get all of these very weird and strange things presented to them. We do here, particularly if you're obviously profiled as having some sort of interest or activity in politics. Let's just have a look at the Democrat convention that is going on at the moment. Joe Biden, obviously, officially, there's no surprises there. It's not news in the sense that he's been confirmed as the candidate that is going to go represent the Democrats in taking on Trump in the presidential elections. What's fascinating in this, Paul, it seems to me, is the Democrats are wrapping around Biden to define who he is, tell the backstory. This is the kind of guy that you will get should he win the presidency. But also with his running mate, who would become vice president in a successful Democrat-run election campaign here, Ms. Harris. There's little known about her, and particularly outside of the western side of the United States, it would appear, amongst the ordinary voter. So therefore defining who she is. Are they getting ahead of Trump on this? Or is Trump still going to be able to define them, his opponents, on his term and seed in the narrative?
I think the way to understand it is the following, and I'll leave aside the president's response just for a second. There are two fundamental pillars to the Democratic campaign ticket, character and demographics.
Yep.
What they're doing is to emphasize Joe Biden's good character versus Donald Trump's bad character. And there's ample examples of both that go down history. They're similar in age, so you can troll back to the 60s and 70s and see where they were, see their respective behaviors, see their behaviors since then. And you can draw, I think, a pretty stark contrast between the two men. The demographic leg of the Democratic strategy has to do with people of color and women, younger people of color and women in particular. And that, too, can be contrasted in stark relief with the MAGA base. The MAGA base, that is Trump's core supporters, are white, middle-aged, lower education males, with some females, used to be suburban females, but it appears that he's losing them. And so the Democrat idea is to appeal to this rising demographic, because let's face it, they have age on their side when compared to the MAGA crowd.
Oh, yeah.
And Biden may not be the sharpest presidential candidate. He may appear lackluster when compared to the likes of Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez.
Yep.
But the point simply is that he's a safe pair of hands. And that can be contrasted with the train wreck that is the current administration. So I think the Democrats have done a good job in that. I don't think that Trump's going to be successful in reframing Biden as a creature of the swamp particularly since Trump has brought in a whole raft of new swamp creatures to benefit from their times in office. And I think that the question then will be, the fundamental question, I think, is how many former Trump voters can Biden claw back to the Democratic Party? Remember that Trump's victory was sealed because white blue-collar workers in places like Michigan and Wisconsin, whether or not it was because they disliked Hillary as the main reason, they voted for Trump. That's a traditional Democratic base. It's traditionally a unionized base. And given the economics of the moment, given the pandemic, which has affected them now quite negatively in these red states, the question then becomes, will Biden and his decency and his appeal to the younger, more colored demographic, female in particular, will that claw votes?
Well, claw votes. As you've been talking, the video clip coming through from Channel 4 on this is underscoring exactly that. It's showing the military brass, including General Colin Powell, who was obviously instrumental and very significant in the George W. Bush administration. You've got John McCain here. John McCain obviously has passed away, seen as a critic of Trump and a person of honor. Military background, of course, we all know that. They're all here with Biden. It's almost like the Democrats are saying, okay, we've had our differences, but on this we have common ground. We've got to get this guy out of the White House, come over, even if it's for once, vote Democrat, and let's get the job done.
Well, that's a very interesting point, because I think a lot of Republicans will vote once and then go back to the Republican Party when they pick a more reasonable candidate. Let's be very clear on this. The security vote tends to go Republican. The security vote is, as the term implies, is very secured about securing the nation. The bipartisan Senate report on the Mueller investigation that was released yesterday is absolutely damning of Trump's relationship with Russia. And Russia is considered the second greatest enemy, not adversary, enemy of the United States by the military brass.
This was one of the big issues this week that we could have spent a whole program on. This is big news coming out of the Senate. The Senate's bipartisan. It's not dominated by the Democrats like the House of Representatives is. This is a different story, and this is showing Mueller's attempt to actually get down to the tin tax as being almost irrelevant. Move over, Sam. This is the big deal here. Yeah.
Think of it this way. I mean, they and again, a lot of these former military people will probably go back to the Republican Party as soon as Trump is gone. But on a domestic level, you had Trump attempt to manipulate the U.S. Armed Forces for domestic riot control. That's a major transgression. And let's just say that after being used by Trump for his photo op at the church, the Joint Chiefs of Staff have taken a step away from him. It's very clear. They've taken a step away.
Very big step.
Now we have concrete evidence that his campaign did collude with the Russians.
Through Manafort, Stone, right in frame here. Reporting...
intelligence with Russian, not just with any old Russian, Russian intelligence officers.
No buffers in evidence, straight to it. Going to Trump, Stone, in Stone's case, it appears from the report, going directly to Trump saying, hey, get excited about this, there's more coming. This is the whole thing. Actually, we could drill down into the whole thing in a big way, and unfortunately we've got to go. But once again, let's pick up some of the big points that present in the next week. We will be back next week, same time, and pushing through the social media channels as well as on our own sites, EveningReport.nz and significantly 36parallel.com. But thanks again, Paul. Thanks for joining us. Thanks for people that have joined the live, and look forward to being here next week.